It is a few minutes before 8 on a Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor, the 7th of December, 1941, and it is beautiful. The sky is clear. The water is flat and bright. On the great grey battleships moored in a neat row along Ford Island, men are eating breakfast, raising colours, easing into the one slow day the Navy allows itself. In a house on the hill above the harbour, a 59-year-old admiral is dressing for a round of golf. He is the most powerful naval commander in the Pacific, and he has spent 10 months preparing his fleet for a war he is certain is coming. He is looking out the window when the first plane drops out of the sky toward the ships below. Within 2 hours, the fleet he built will be burning in the mud, and within 2 months, the United States government will decide that the man at the window is the reason it happened, and it will take him the rest of his life, and his sons' lives after him, to force the truth back into the record. Before we go further, one thing has to be said. Admiral Husband Kimmel was a real man. The attack on Pearl Harbor is one of the most documented events in American history. The 9 separate investigations that followed are real, and their findings are on the record, including the ones that were buried. The intelligence that Washington held and did not send is documented. The resolution the United States Senate passed in 1999, 58 years later, is real, and so is the fact that no president has ever acted on it. What is reconstructed here is the texture, the golf date, the view from the window, the things a man says on the worst morning of his life. The events are real. The man was real. The way it is told here is the closest the record allows, and the record, in this story, is the whole point. Here is the thing to hold on to, because everything turns on it. The man who commanded the Pacific Fleet was also the man who was kept in the dark. Kimmel was responsible for the defense of Pearl Harbor. He was also denied the single most important piece of information the United States possessed about what Japan was going to do. Both of those are true. The Navy that put him in command did not give him what it knew, and when the disaster came, it was easier and cleaner and far more convenient to blame the man on the hill than the men in Washington who had read Tokyo's mail and said nothing. This is the story of how that happened, and of how long it took anyone to admit it. Husband Edward Kimmel was a career sailor from Kentucky, a serious, exacting man who had spent 37 years in the Navy without ever being accused of carelessness. In February of 1941, he was jumped over dozens of more senior officers and given command of the entire Pacific Fleet, promoted overnight to 4 stars. He did not treat it as an honor to enjoy. He treated it as a warning. He believed war with Japan was coming, and coming soon, and he drilled his fleet harder than it had ever been drilled, took it to sea, ran it ragged, and asked Washington, again and again, for more of everything. More planes for reconnaissance, more men, more warning. He was, by every account, a commander who took the danger seriously. He had spent 10 months worrying about exactly the kind of attack that was about to fall on him. That is the cruelty at the center of this. The man who was blamed for being unprepared had been sounding the alarm the whole time, and here is what he did not have. By 1941, American codebreakers had cracked the highest Japanese diplomatic cipher. The operation was called Magic, and it meant that in Washington, a small circle of officials could read the secret messages passing between Tokyo and its embassies almost as fast as the Japanese could. It was one of the greatest intelligence advantages any nation has ever held. In the months before the attack, Magic produced a message in which Tokyo asked its consulate in Honolulu to divide Pearl Harbor into a grid and report exactly which warships were moored in which square. It was, in hindsight, a bombing plan. That message was read in Washington. It was not sent to the admiral whose ships were sitting in that grid. Kimmel was defending a harbor, while the men above him read the enemy's interest in it and decided he did not need to know. He was not told nothing. On the 27th of November, 10 days before the attack, Washington sent him a war warning, a message stating that negotiations with Japan had broken down and that hostile action was possible at any moment. But the same message pointed his attention across the ocean, naming the Philippines, Thailand, and Southeast Asia as the likely targets. Nobody told him the blow might fall on Hawaii. So Kimmel prepared for what he had been told to expect. He guarded against sabotage. He worried about submarines. He did not launch the exhausting, round-the-clock, long-range air patrols that might have spotted a carrier force because he did not have the planes to sustain them and had no specific reason to believe the threat was coming from the empty sea to the north. He made his decisions with the picture he had been given. The picture had been edited before it reached him. In the last days, the intelligence in Washington grew frantic. Magic intercepted Tokyo ordering its Honolulu consulate to report on the harbor more often. It intercepted a long, final message breaking off negotiations, and then a message instructing the Japanese ambassadors to deliver it at precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Washington time, on the 7th of December. To the officers who read it, that hour meant something. 1 o'clock in Washington was just before dawn at Pearl Harbor. Someone in Washington understood that morning that a deadline had been set and that it lined up with sunrise over Hawaii. A warning was finally written to send to the Pacific commanders, but it was not marked urgent, and the fastest secure channels were down, and so the warning to Pearl Harbor went out by commercial telegraph, like an ordinary cable, racing a war it had already lost. The morning gave him chances, and the system let each one slip. Just before 7, a Navy destroyer at the harbor mouth found and sank a small Japanese submarine trying to slip inside, and reported it, and the report climbed the chain of command too slowly to matter. Up on the North Shore, 2 young Army privates at a new radar set saw a huge formation of aircraft appear on their screen, the largest they had ever tracked, and telephoned it in, and were told not to worry about it, that it was surely a flight of American bombers due in from the mainland. Every alarm that could have sounded was sounding, in time, because nothing in the system had told anyone that this was the morning to listen. So the fleet slept in. The ships lay moored in pairs along Ford Island, exactly as the grid message had described them, their anti-aircraft guns mostly unmanned, much of their ammunition locked away, their crews at breakfast. It was the most powerful concentration of naval force in the Pacific, and it was arranged that morning for a peacetime Sunday. 200 miles to the north, 6 Japanese aircraft carriers turned into the wind and began launching. The first wave climbed and formed up and turned south toward the still, bright water, and the men flying it could not believe their luck. The harbor was lit up and waiting, and no one below had any idea they were coming. It began at 7:55 in the morning. The dive bombers came first, out of the northern sky, and then the torpedo planes came in, low over the water toward Battleship Row, and then the whole harbor came apart at once. Torpedoes tore into the sides of the great ships. Armor-piercing bombs punched through their decks. The battleship Arizona took a bomb down through her forward magazine and blew up, a column of fire and steel 1,000 feet high, and 1,100 men died in a single instant. The Oklahoma rolled completely over with her crew still inside. Ships burned and settled into the mud with their flags still up. In less than an hour and a half, in 2 waves, the striking heart of the United States Pacific Fleet was wrecked at its moorings, and more than 2,400 Americans were dead. Up on the hill, Admiral Kimmel stood at the window of his headquarters and watched it happen. There was nothing else he could do. The disaster he had spent 10 months trying to prevent was unfolding in front of him, complete beyond any order he could give. As he stood there, a spent bullet, fired from somewhere in the chaos below, crashed through the glass and struck him in the chest, hard enough to bruise, and fell to the floor, its force already gone. He bent and picked it up. He looked at it, this small thing that had reached him and done nothing, and he said quietly to the officer beside him that it would have been merciful if it had killed him. He understood, standing at that window, that whatever else happened in the war to come, his part in it was already over, and that the ruin below would have his name on it. He was right. By that afternoon, while the fires were still burning, and men were still trapped in the hulls of the capsized ships, the search for someone to blame had already begun, and it did not have far to look. A nation in shock needed an answer, and the answer could not be that the government in Washington had read the enemy's intentions and failed to act on them. Because most of the country couldn't hold that Washington had been reading anything at all. The secret that had been kept from Kimmel before the attack would now be kept from the public after it, and that meant the explanation for Pearl Harbor could not be the truth. It had to be a man. 9 days after the attack, Admiral Kimmel was relieved of command. He reverted to his permanent rank, 2 stars, a rear admiral again, the 4 stars gone as if they had never been. Then in January, a commission led by a Supreme Court justice examined the disaster in secret, with Kimmel given almost no chance to defend himself and no access to the intelligence that would have explained his decisions. The commission's finding was a single devastating phrase: dereliction of duty. Those 3 words went into the record of a 37-year officer, and they went out to the country as the official explanation for the worst day in the history of the United States Navy. The admiral who had begged Washington for was now, on paper, the man who had failed to be ready. The men who had held the warning back were not named at all. Kimmel asked for the one thing an accused officer is supposed to be able to demand: a trial, a court-martial, in the open, where he could see the evidence against him and answer it, where the whole record, including the intercepts, would have to come out. He asked for it for years. He was never given it. And the reason he was refused is the reason that gives the whole story away. A public trial would have required the Japanese codes, and the government was still reading those codes and winning battles because of it. To try Kimmel honestly would have meant showing the country what Washington had known. So he was never tried. He was simply left convicted in the public mind denied the hearing that might have cleared him, precisely because a fair hearing was too dangerous to the people who had failed him. And here is what did not happen. No one in Washington who had read the grid message and not forwarded it was relieved of duty. No one who had let the final warning go out by slow commercial cable was named in the papers. The officials who held the greatest intelligence advantage in the nation's history and failed to get it to the one commander who needed it most were not made to answer for it. Not then. The system had produced a catastrophe, and the system had produced exactly one name to carry it, and the name belonged to the man who had been kept outside the room where the decisions were made. In 1944, a Navy Court of Inquiry, finally allowed to see more of the evidence, concluded that Kimmel had committed no dereliction and had made reasonable decisions with what he was given. That finding was classified and kept quiet. The record the public saw did not change, so he carried it. For the rest of the war and for more than 20 years after it, the official memory of the United States held that Husband Kimmel had failed at Pearl Harbor. He knew that a court had cleared him and that the finding was locked away. He knew that the intelligence which would explain everything sat classified in Washington. He knew the record was wrong in the specific provable way that a man knows a thing and cannot make the world admit it. He had spent his career believing that the Navy dealt in facts and that the facts would eventually come out. Now he was the proof of how long facts can be held under, and of how a man can be right for decades and still lose, every single day, to a piece of paper with his name and the wrong 3 words on it. He did not stop. He retired, went to work in industry, and spent the rest of his life assembling his own defense, gathering the documents as they slowly declassified, writing his account of what he had and had not been told. He testified whenever he was allowed to. He watched the intercepts come to light, one after another, each one confirming what he had said all along, that the warning had existed and had not reached him. One of his sons, a submarine commander, was lost with his boat in the Pacific in the war his father had been blamed for failing to prepare for. Husband Kimmel died in 1968, still fighting, the 3 words still on his record. His family did not stop either. His sons, and then his grandsons, kept the case alive, kept filing, kept insisting, decade after decade, that the record be corrected. The corrections came, and came late, and came incomplete. As the decades passed and the secrets declassified, historians and eventually the government itself confirmed the shape of what had happened, that Pearl Harbor's commanders had been denied vital intelligence. In 1995, a Defense Department study concluded the blame had been placed too narrowly on 2 men. And in 1999, 58 years after the attack, the United States Senate passed a resolution finding that Kimmel and his Army counterpart had performed their duties competently and professionally, that they had been denied crucial intelligence, and that they should be posthumously restored to their highest wartime ranks. The Senate asked the president to do it. That was the last step, and no president of either party from that day to this has ever taken it. So the record still stands, half corrected, the way records often do. The Congress of the United States has said, formally, that the man was denied the truth and does not deserve the blame he carries, and the stars he lost have never been given back. He was responsible for a harbor and kept from the knowledge that could have saved it, and then he was named as the cause of the very disaster he had feared and warned against, and the paper that says so has outlived him by more than half a century. That is the whole story, and it is not really a story about a Sunday morning. Chen. It is a story about the distance between what a man knew, what his government knew, and what the record was allowed to say, and about how a man can spend his life standing in that distance, insisting quietly on a truth that everyone eventually admits, and no one quite gets around to fixing. He was right, at the window. He was right for the rest of his life. The record still hasn't finished catching up.